Chapter 17 The Sunset Vision. The General Conference of 1812, the first delegated convention of the Church, was looked forward to with concern by Asbury and the other Methodist leaders. It was expected that its actions would severely test the strength and utility of the Constitution, but the session passed without stress or crucial issue. The new order followed the old as one stage of life succeeds another. Methodism, which originated in a series of unmistakable providences, was not left to chance, nor to the unaided counsels of men in settling the enduring principles of its polity. The Constitution, which developed out of experience and necessity, answered naturally to the Methodist history and expansion. This General Conference, the last of which Asbury attended, was opened by him in the usual simple way, that is, with scripture reading, song, and prayer. 90 delegates were seated in the audience room of the historic John Street Church, New York City. Rules of order, described as being a reduction of the Jeffersonian manual, were brought in, but were soon found to be cumbersome and impracticable, and so were promptly abandoned for a simpler and more common sense code. Bishop McKendry introduced, very early in the session, a departure which became a precedent in all subsequent general conferences, and which has greatly helped to illuminate the paths of Methodist legislation. He submitted to the General Conference a written address setting forth his views on the state and needs of the connection. To this act of his colleague, Asbury offered the obligation that it was an innovation and needless, but after McKendry had briefly expounded his reasons for the step, the venerable man acquiesced with a smile. Later, on his own behalf, he addressed the conference through his colleague in much the same spirit, but also to much the same end. It was characteristic of Asbury that, self-sufficient though he was in his mastery of men and affairs, when shown the advantage of a new method or departure, he was quick to fall in with it, and nursed no sentiment of pride which prevented him from profiting by it to the fullest. An example of this was the spirit in which he finally abandoned the plan of a council for that of a delegated general conference. For a body so historically important, the session of the General Conference of 1812 accomplished but little that was of lasting significance. There was, in fact, but little demand for new legislation. The validation of the joint action of the bishops in creating the Genesee Conference, the division of the Western Conference into the Ohio and Tennessee Conferences, the making of local deacons eligible to orders, and a fresh refusal to take the appointment of the presiding elders out of the hands of the bishops, and leave their selection to majority vote of the annual conference, practically outlines the work of the entire sitting. Bishop Asbury had, for some time, had in contemplation a visit to his early home and friends in England, and had planned to begin his journey thither soon after the adjournment of the General Conference. This had led Bishop McKendry to suggest in his address to the conference the propriety of strengthening the episcopacy by the election of an additional bishop. Both the address of Bishop McKendry and the verbal communication of Bishop Asbury were referred to a committee styled the Committee on Episcopacy, consisting of one member from each annual conference, an order which has ever since obtained. The committee reported unfavorably on the request of Bishop Asbury to be permitted to visit Europe although it appeared that an invitation to do so had been extended him by the British Wesleyan Conference. Several reasons seem to have influenced this committee in denying this request. First, the confidence of the American preachers in Asbury's leadership was the only equaled by their love for him. They also feared a repetition of the embarrassments which had come upon the connection through the continued absences of Bishop Coke. Should Asbury be given a leave of absence from the continent, it would mean, as they viewed it, a suspension for the time of his episcopal functions. That had been the rule applied to Coke, and they could not contemplate their patriarch in a similar situation with other feelings than those of personal distress. Just then, too, the shadows of the Second War with Great Britain were deepening on the land, and hostilities actually began within the next few weeks. The whole truth is, the American preachers, one and all, felt that the cause they represented was safer when Asbury was near at hand, and in their councils he could not be spared. The decision not to consent to Asbury's proposed European visit put an end to the scheme for electing a third bishop. Asbury renewed his pledge to serve the connection with all his powers of body and mind, as long and as largely as he could, and the incident was closed. An important thing to remember in spiritual matters is that it's about the teaching more than it is about the teacher. So sometimes you do somebody is, the person for the role, but the order of journey made by the two bishops immediately following the General Conference was much the same as in former years. It was up through the Middle States, across New England, southward through western New York and Pennsylvania, into the great valleys of the West, and back to the Atlantic seaboard. In the Carolinas, the initial sessions of the new conferences, Ohio and Tennessee, were noteworthy incidents of the year. The former met in Chillicothe, which brought Asbury back to a circle of old friends and to the springs of tender memories. On the journey southward, he preached in the new State House at Frankfort and visited Louisville. Coming to Nashville, he found a neat new brick meeting house, 34 feet square, with galleries. This was one of the half-dozen predecessors of the present McKendree Church, the Jerusalem House of Southern Methodism. From Nashville together, the two bishops journeyed to Fountainhead in Sumner County, Tennessee, where in connection with the camp meeting, the Tennessee Conference was to be held. It was on or near these grounds that 23 years later, the dust of McKendree was to find sepulture. And though, after 40 years, that dust was to be given a new resting place on the campus of Vanderbilt University, the original marble slab still marks as a cenotaph the place where he slept. You see that? Don't make my gravestone bigger than that, unless there's just not a smaller rock, not a rock any smaller than what you're using that can be used. The conference, which met at Charleston, South Carolina, in December of this year, and which Asbury attended with something of his old-time relish and exhilaration, is to be remembered as the session at which James O'Andrew was received on trial. The future bishop and destined divider of the world, a rustic lad of 19, almost wholly unlettered and wholly inexperienced, was not at the conference, but awaited in his father's cabin in the eastern reaches of Georgia, the scarcely hoped-for tidings that he had been accepted as an itinerant Methodist preacher. The potencies which afterwards burst like a storm about the head of this man and dissevered the house of Methodism were then lying dormant in an ill-shaped and ill-administered rule on African slavery, the age which might have anticipated and prevented the distresses of a future day lacked both foresight and the unity demanded by its opportunity. Both the room of history is large. In June 1813, seeing how his strength ebbed, Asbury made his will, naming as his executors Bishop McKendry, Daniel Hitt, book agent of the church, and Henry Boehm, his faithful traveling companion. His estate, as he himself esteemed it, was worth about $2,000. This had come to him chiefly through the generosity of friends in Maryland. The whole sum was bequeathed to the book concern. Let it return, he wrote, and continued to aid the cause of piety. It is doing its work today in the apportioned publishing funds of the two Episcopal Methodisms. In the course of the year's conference visitations, Asbury began to see the advantages of McKendry's plan for a cabinet of presiding elders in making the appointments. The presiding eldership and the episcopacy saw eye to eye in the business of the stations. He wrote about this time, "There was no murmurings from the 84 employed. This was the bishop's last full year of work. He completed with McKendry the round of the inhabited republic, except the territory of Mississippi, and he still hoped to see this, but the time was come to relax, and he had ridden 5,000 miles during 8 months, and had done the work of a bishop, but on the peaceful banks of the Saluda. It came to him to write a valedictory address to the presiding elders, and to signify to his colleague that henceforth the burden was to weigh more heavily on his shoulders. This, not that he meant to cease altogether from labors, but that he felt himself no longer able to bear the heavy crown of responsibility. He was ripe for release, but like the aged St. John, he craved the joy of prophesying to the end. And of course, prophesying should not be just what you feel and think. Prophesying needs to be a spiritual gift. And if you're interpreting the spiritual matters, it's not prophecy either. It was during this year that he met for the last time his faithful friend, Otterbein. The two venerable men had a long and soulful interview with an affectionate leave-taking. Shortly after this, the great German leader was gathered to his fathers, remembered as a great and faithful leader. In 1814, Henry Boehm found it necessary to terminate the arrangement he had made with Bishop Asbury to be his traveling companion. For 5 years, he had almost constantly at the side of the Methodist patriarch. He had been almost constantly at the side of the Methodist patriarch, and had come to know and share as few men had his thought and confidence. Many years afterwards, he, as has already been stated, he published the notes which he kept during his long attendance upon the heads of the church, for Bishop McKendry was seldom himself separated from his colleague in his travels. The Boehm reminisces that Now, why can't I keep messing up? Reminiscence. Reminiscence. Okay, you know what I'm trying to say. Have been most helpful in filling up the gaps of the history of the joint Asbury and McKendry administration. Reminiscences. Okay. Having lost the services of Boham, Bishop Asbury applied to the Baltimore Conference for the detachment of one of its members to serve him in that stead. The choice fell upon John Wesley Bond. The selection was happy and fitting, and brought to the invalid during the remaining days of his life a congenial companionship and a faithful and tender ministry. Both Calvary and the Transfiguration were on the sufferer in those days. I groan 1 minute in pain and shout glory the next. So he wrote, and so it was with him. And now came to Asbury a sorrow such as he had not felt since the death of Wesley. While on a mission voyage to India, Thomas Coke died and was buried in the Indian Ocean, eastward off the Cape of Good Hope. Bishop Coke is not only entitled to be called the foreign minister of Methodism, but his claim to a place amongst the very first and greatest missionaries of the world is beyond dispute. In 1813, he completed a plan for planting missionary stations across half the world. To this enterprise he pledged his private fortune, which was not small. He also succeeded in committing to his enterprise a goodly number of his Wesleyan brethren. With these having obtained the endorsement of the British Conference, he set sail in December for Ceylon, but on May 2nd, 1814, he expired. And his body was given the sea for a mausoleum. His companions went on with the enterprise and established in India the mission stations that, in their growth, have made the Wesleyan Church one of the greatest missionary forces of the world. The news of the death of his former colleagues did not reach Asbury until many months after it occurred. The testimony which he bore to his memory was characteristic and eloquent. In his journal stand these words: Thomas Coke, of the third branch of Oxonian Methodists, as a minister of Christ in zeal, in labors, and in services, the greatest man of the last century. A new feature of comfort was added to Asbury's western journey in the year 1814. Sometime early in the year, friends in Philadelphia presented him with a light four-wheeled carriage. This was the chaise in which he made his last episcopal visitation, and in which he rode until the horsemen of Israel hailed him for the ascent of the skies. At the Ohio Conference, he attempted to preside, Bishop McKendry having been so seriously crippled by a fall from his horse as not to be able to be present. The task, however, proved too much for his strength, so he resigned both the chair and the stations into the hands of John Sale, an elder who had been elected by the conference to preside. The presbyter easily met the demands of the post. The success of this necessary expedient gave Asbury great satisfaction. The conferences are now out of their infancy, he mused. Their rulers can now be called from amongst themselves. As a father who, unmindful of the growth of his sons that moved about him from day to day, awakes from a life dream to see his offspring standing shoulder to shoulder with himself. So Asbury awoke to find his spiritual sons of a stature that he had not noted, except in worth and wisdom of soul. There were many about him who easily overtopped his own venerable head. At the Tennessee Conference, a month later, he stood more firmly on his feet, and would have set out from that point for the far-away Natchez stations, but Bishop McKendry's disabled condition rendered such a course impossible. Within a fortnight, Asbury's strength had again failed, and he was admonished that the end of his pilgrimage was near. From October 1814 to October 1815, he dragged a constantly halting and suffering body around his wonted circuit of 6,000 to 8,000 miles, but it was no more to utter the voice of command, but to say farewells to those who should see his face no more. Everywhere he spoke words of tenderness and warning, and preached the message of perfect love. That there could be such a thing. The time is short was a refrain in his sermons, which all men remembered. One who saw him about this time wrote of him thus: in appearance he was a picture of plainness and simplicity, an old man, spare and tall, but remarkably clean, with a plain frock coat, drab or mixed waistcoat, and small clothes of the same kind, a neat stock, a broad-brimmed hat with an uncommon low crown, while his white locks, vulnerable with age, added a simplicity to his appearance it is not easy to describe. True to his practical instincts, even in these tottering days, he carried around the continent his favorite mite subscription list for the relief of the ministry, a feeble but well-meant means for supplying the gigantic defects of a primitive and mistakenly conceived system of church finance. Nearing the seaboard in 1815, he learned with joy of the treaty of peace which ended the Second War with Great Britain. A few days later, his patriotic resentment was stirred by a sight of the charred ruins of the President's house and the Capitol at Washington. Twice had his heart, once in his prime and then in his old age, supported contending emotions of love and loyalty for his native land and the land of his adoption. Passing through Virginia, he had entertained by the fourth generation of the Jarratts, whose fellowship awakened within him memories of the early revival, which, in a time of trial, had strengthened his soul and fixed his purpose to remain in America. Now he saw again Perry Hall, and for the last time rested his weary body within its hollowed walls. Some weeks later he was at Croton, in the state of New York, the home of his great and influential friend, Governor Van Cortlandt. But the mighty man of faith and deeds had gone to his rest. A voice was speaking above the sleeping dust, but a living voice called the weary apostle onward. The cessation of war had again opened the gate to Canada, and he had already laid special plans for the rehabilitation of the work beyond the St. Lawrence. At the New England Conference, which he had undertaken to hold in the absence of Bishop McKendry, he was unable to preside, and George Pickering filled the chair and sat with the cabinet in stationing the preachers. By a shortened line of travel, the bishop and his companion returned to Maryland, where he completed the revision of his journal. Of this journal, he says, as a record of the early history of Methodism in America, it will be of use and, accompanied by the minutes of the conference, will tell all that will be necessary to know. I have buried in shades all that will be proper to forget. The summertide was now at its height, and the genial sunshine had stayed a little the course of his malady. He railed perceptibly and entered upon his last journey to the west in comparative comfort of body. But the winds of autumn that met him in the distant Ohio Valley quickly relegated him to his former condition of all but helpless invalidism. Blistering and bleeding were his remedies for anemia and inanition. Unbelievable empiricism. Incredible credulity of the age, but suffering many things, both of his disorders and his physicians, an uncomplaining invalid crept on, distributing testaments where he could not preach, and dispersing amongst his needy brethren the mite fund which he had collected with infinite patience and zeal, while journeying from Ohio toward the seat of the Tennessee Conference, through the succession of rich valleys that made the virgin land, he heard voices calling through the soft autumn winds, and saw doors opening through the glory of blue horizons and through uplooming hills, dappled with the hues of changing foliage. This western part of the empire, he said to McKendree, will be the glory of America. There should be 5 conferences marked out here. One of his latter successors in office, commenting on these words, says, where he would have been content with 5 conferences, we now have 50. So have the people called the Methodists multiplied and replenished the lands. But the voices which Asbury heard and the visions which he saw did not deceive him. He saw the future unfold its wonders, but he saw not all. The Tennessee Conference session fell at Bethlehem, near Lebanon, in the early days of October 1815. It was Asbury's last conference. He arrived at his chaise in good time, but was unable either to preside or to arrange the stations. He preached on the Sabbath and ordained the deacons. With that he laid down the episcopal office. His journey carries the sad record in these words: my eyes fail, I resign the stations to Bishop McKendree. I will take away my feet. One earthly wish remained. It was to meet the General Conference, called to sit in Baltimore the following May. For the long journey thither to be husbanded his strength. Nearly 20 times he had scaled the Appalachian barriers. For 31 successive years, with a single break, he had visited the valleys of the Holston and the Cumberland. They were to him what Hebron was to Caleb, a southland with springs of water. But now, from the heights of the Alps, he took his last view of them. A sigh of regret and a shout of triumph mingled his emotions, and he set his face toward Maryland after having foregone his dream of a midwinter's rest in Charleston. During his slow progress through South Carolina, he completed, as far as he was able, an address for the General Conference and a communication to Bishop McKendry. He also dictated a lengthy letter to Reverend Joseph Benson of the English Conference, the original of which is now in my possession in the hand of an amanuensis, as it was unsigned. It is almost certain that it was never transmitted to the great commentator. The last entry made in his journal was on December 7th, 1815. But it was the 20th day of the month before he finally abandoned the hope of reaching Charleston and turned northward. He was then near the middle of the state of South Carolina, but though he traveled as the weather and his strength permitted, so feeble was he and so frequently was his companion constrained to halt that he might rest. They reached Richmond, Virginia, only at the end of 3 months. Frequently, during this stage of his journey, he attempted to preach, but his voice was too weak to be heard except by those near his person. However, having arrived at Richmond, with his traveling companion on Monday, March 18th, he announced his purpose to speak to the congregation in the old meeting house on the following Sabbath, and I'm sure they mean Sunday, but friends undertook to dissuade him from this course, but his reply was that he had a special call to give his testimony in that place. Strong and loyal hands lifted him into his carriage, and he was driven to the door of the sanctuary he loved. Again he was tenderly lifted and borne into the church, where a chair had been placed for him upon a table within the chancel. Thus seated, he discoursed for nearly an hour, and with this surprising sustained voice and power from Romans 9:28, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, and because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth.